This isn't about some great philosophical question of when life begins. This is about control. We tend to have this view of American exceptionalism, that we've such a great democracy and so much liberty and freedom that we don't need human rights. We need to, really destigmatize the conversation around abortion and recognize it as a human right. When you get people pouring into the streets, it's energizing, it's uplifting. It reminds me that we're there in community, that there are other people. I think it brings people together in a way that nothing else does. In any good protest, there's always sort of an edge to it that it could demand more than the establishment wants. More people believe more strongly than we think and than we know, and that's part of creating the change we need.
Welcome to episode 142 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. In today's episode, Coco Das shares Rise Up for Abortion Rights statement on the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And then we share an interview with human rights attorney and author Julie F. Kay. But first, if you appreciate the show and want to help us reach more people who want to refuse fascism, be a gem and go write a review and drop 5 stars wherever you listen to your pods. Here's one review we received earlier this month from 120983446, who gave it 5 stars and titled their review, "Excellent Show with Equally Excellent Guests." They wrote, quote, "If accurate, in-depth examinations of current political events with a strong mix of historical perspective is your bailiwick, then, did I say that right? Then Refuse Fascism will not disappoint. Always on target and no mincing of words in informing us all about the many aspects of the far right, be they fascists, ultranationalists, sociopaths, or outright criminal. Here be dragons slayed." End quote. Well, thank you. We do try. Note that those ultranationalist sociopaths and criminals are also fascists. And we got this email from John, quote, "It was a great conversation on the findings of the January 6th committee. This is my 4th or 5th episode of listening to Refuse Fascism. Each one is as good as the previous one, or better. Sam, you're good at keeping the conversation moving while at the same time expressing your thoughts, whether they may or may not align with theirs. You're honest. I have since donated and received my caps." End quote. Well, keep listening, man, and keep sending your thoughts. So glad to have you in this community. Thanks for donating. Glad you got your caps. Love to see some pics of you rocking them. And for those of you listening, if you didn't catch the episode that he's talking about, it's our last episode. Give it a listen. After today's show, please tell the people out there in podcast land why you listen and why they should too. Subscribe, follow, so you never miss an episode. And of course, continue all that sharing and commenting on social media. You may have noticed I am even more congested than usual. I'm recovering from COVID, and I really hope that I am not too painful on your ears. So apologies in advance. Today should mark half a century of Roe v. Wade as law of the land. But thanks to the illegitimate, Trump-packed, fascist Supreme Court, the legal right to abortion was overturned on June 24th. 44 million women and girls live in states that ban or restrict abortion and reproductive health care. The war on abortion waged by women-hating, theocratic Christian fascists for decades has been the linchpin of a vicious American fascist movement built on white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia. Their aim is nothing less than the consolidation of fascist rule, one that violently reasserts the domination of white male supremacy over all of society and government. Unsure of this? Just listen to Steve Scalise, Majority Leader of the House of Representatives speaking on Friday to the March for Life, making clear that for these Christian fascists, Roe was just the beginning.
You're in a battle. It's important to keep your focus on what the mission is, but every step of the way, it's also critical that we celebrate victories along the way. And boy, did we get a huge victory just a few months ago when Roe was overturned. But as you all know, that's only the end of the first phase of this battle. The next phase now begins, and that's what this year's march is all about. The next steps in a post-Roe era.
On this same day, Alex Mooney introduced the Life Begins at Conception Act, seeking to codify fetal personhood and ban abortion nationwide. And Rep. Lauren Boebert's first act of the year was filing the Defund Planned Parenthood Act, a one-year moratorium on federal funds allotted to Planned Parenthood. Meanwhile, last weekend, there was a firebombing causing extensive damage to Peoria Health Center, a Planned Parenthood clinic, just days after sweeping abortion protections were signed into law in Illinois. Looking to just one state, Arkansas, as an example of where things are headed, I think is really helpful. In Arkansas, abortion is already illegal. No exceptions for rape or incest. But Republicans in a new bill are pushing to allow women to be prosecuted for the quote-unquote death of an unborn child. Any quote-unquote death that is caused by, quote, wrongful act, neglect, or default, end quote. As Jessica Valenti reported, quote, we already know that prosecutors across multiple states have used fetal personhood laws to arrest women for stillbirths and miscarriages for reasons ranging from alleged drug use, refusing medical interventions like a C-section, even a suicide attempt. So this kind of criminalization is not without precedence, end quote. Keep in mind, this bill defines an quote-unquote unborn child as existing from the point of fertilization. Pulling back the lens, research by Gender Equity Policy Institute found that mothers in states with abortion bans are nearly 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy, childbirth, or soon after giving birth. Babies in those states were 30% more likely to die within their first few months. There are many other key findings in this report, so go check it out. What I've shared is just a relatively small window into the horror that is already washing over vast swaths of this country. In a series of thought pieces reflecting on the loss of this fundamental right, there seemed to me to be a push to look past all this. It's no big deal. In fact, it's an opportunity, prettifying the moment. Meanwhile, the horror is real and overwhelming. The eagerness to turn people's eyes away from the atrocity that's only getting started cannot be allowed. It does nobody any favors on an individual level, certainly not those who are suffering the most, and on a societal level, serve only to domesticate dissent and foster complacency. The advocates of this are the same folks that kept you off the streets when there was a rolling coup and when it was crystal clear that Roe was on the chopping block. To be clear, I don't discount the potential. In fact, I do have great hope. But whether we can wrench anything positive out of this post-Roe horror show is deeply connected to whether people are willing to confront the reality we face and its fascist trajectory, whether we as a people examine how we got here and express a willingness to take a clear-eyed look at what's perpetuating this, what's required to stop it. Such confrontation, such interrogation and struggle doesn't need to be paralyzing at all. In fact, it can be uplifting. Abortion provider Franz Third, in his recent interview with Vice, put it this way, quote, we got complacent. You know, in 1984, 85, 86, when we had picketers for us. We had pro-choice and pro-life picketers fighting it out. I haven't seen one pro-choice banner, picketer, or supporter in my clinic here or in Texas in the past 20 years. Doctors will say, oh yeah, man, I believe in what you do. Those assholes are picketing your clinic. Good to hear. Do you want to come help me with the procedure? End quote. And I would add to everyone, do you want to shut it all down for abortion rights with me? With that, Here's Coco Das, fellow member of Refuse Fascism's editorial board, frequent guest and guest host of the pod, sharing Rise Up for Abortion Rights statement on the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade.
From Rise Up for Abortion Rights on 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. We must fight for legal abortion on demand and without apology nationwide and everywhere. On the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, we face the bitter reality that the fundamental constitutional right to abortion has been brutally stripped away. That Roe v. Wade didn't make it to 50 is a cause for grief, rage, reflection, and action. Forced motherhood is female enslavement, and half of humanity in this country, yes, all over this country, have become second-class citizens. You've heard the heart-wrenching stories. The 10-year-old rape victim almost forced to give birth to her rapist baby. Women being brought to the brink of death from sepsis or bleeding out before they can get care for miscarriages or high-risk pregnancies. The desperate tears and pleas for help when patients expecting to get abortions were turned away from clinics the day Roe was overturned. Think, too, of all the stories we haven't heard, from those who desperately struggle to scrape up enough money to take time off from work, find childcare, and travel to states where a backlog of patients means they still might not get the abortion they so desperately need. From those tens of thousands who have already been forced to have children against their will. From those whose unwanted pregnancies trap them in abusive relationships or drag them further into poverty. This is a discriminatory, dystopian, misogynist reality that must never be minimized, tolerated, or accommodated to. The attack on abortion rights is part of a patriarchal Christian fascist program that takes aim at contraception as well as LGBTQ rights. Denying the right to abortion hits poor women, and especially Black and other women of color, with vicious consequence, tightening the chains of both white supremacy and the subjugation of women. This is only the beginning. The fascist-dominated Supreme Court has opened the floodgates for states to pass more and more draconian laws to enslave and punish girls and women who dare to step outside their prescribed roles as mothers and breeders of children. It is of great political and historical importance that Rise Up for Abortion Rights united people from very diverse political perspectives and unleashed the fury of tens of thousands of young women and many others in mass nonviolent action, with the aim of stopping the Supreme Court from overturning Roe. In the end, the fight to save Roe did not reach the size, determination, or unity needed to win, but we modeled courage, inspired millions, and dared to speak the truth about what this rollback is really about. The idea that we have to fight for women's civil rights, state by state, only normalizes the concept of women's fundamental rights being based on local public opinion. Would you accept the right to free speech, or the right to vote, or the right to worship in only half the country? We demand legal abortion on demand and without apology everywhere. The right to legal safe abortion is the front line and the bottom line of women's freedom. As long as one woman or girl is not free, none of us are free. Our only way forward and our best way forward is to resist, to rise up. We urge everyone who cares about women and girls and justice overall to reach out to us, to strategize and work together. There is a great struggle to be waged. Together in our millions, we can and must act to win back the fundamental right to legal, safe abortion. The illegitimate overturning of abortion rights must not stand. Forced motherhood equals female enslavement. Legal abortion on demand and without apology nationwide.
Shout out to those who took this message to the streets today. For more, visit riseup4abortionrights.org. I wanted to share an excerpt of a piece Sansara Taylor, co-initiator and leader of Rise Up for Abortion Rights and co-host of the RNL show, wrote from her personal perspective on the 50th anniversary of Roe. I encourage folks to consider her piece in full. Quote, "Have you let yourself think critically about the quote-unquote strategy you are being fed and too often embracing by the Democrats and the so-called leaders of the so-called pro-choice movement? They straight up refused to mobilize any serious fight in the streets against the overturning of Roe. Some of them even attacked the one group, Rise Up for Abortion Rights, that did lead tens of thousands to wage this fight. Now, these so-called leaders are pushing a state-by-state strategy aimed at protecting abortion rights in a few places. Never mind the millions of women left behind. Never mind that any state protections could be reversed in a heartbeat by the fascist Supreme Court. Never mind that this state-by-state strategy accepts and legitimizes the outrageous, illegitimate notion that women's rights are not fundamental and should be left up to each area as just a matter of taste. Will you continue to go along with this? The fury of millions of women and everyone who cares about justice, your fury needs to be unleashed now in the streets in mass struggle to demand legal abortion on demand and without apology nationwide. Draw inspiration from the brave women and the people of Iran. A society that enslaves women should not be allowed to function as quote-unquote normal, end quote. And if you want some comedic relief, check out our friend Walter Masterson's epic trolling of anti-abortion Christian fascists in NYC. See the link in the show notes. In my interview with Julie, I grossly undercounted the amount of women, girls, and others that would be forced to give birth against their will if we allow the lack of federal protection of abortion rights to continue for decades. Those who advocate for a 40-year struggle are accepting millions of women and girls to have children against their will. Already, approximately 100,000 women and girls have been forced to give birth against their will since the fall of Roe. Now, here is my interview recorded earlier this month with Julie. I am really honored to get a chance to talk to our next guest. Julie F.K. is an internationally recognized human rights lawyer and co-author of Controlling Women: What We Must Do Now to Save Reproductive Freedom. She successfully argued against Ireland's ban on abortion before the European Court of Human Rights. Welcome, Julie. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I wanted to start with the title of your book, Controlling Women. What does control have to do with abortion rights? Because isn't it just healthcare?
Well, thank you for starting.
I say sarcastically, but yeah. I feel like it's important.
And the title is a bit tongue in cheek because this is about controlling sexuality and controlling childbearing and some of the most intimate human rights that we have. The title Controlling Women is really sort of a nod to where we think the opposition is coming from, that it's about really deciding who has children, with whom, when, and how, but also about sexuality. I mean, abortion and contraception allow people, and women in particular, to have sex without consequences. And some of the consequences traditionally have been forced marriage, have been forced pregnancy, have been derailing education, all these other kinds of societal effects that happen when you can't control your own body, your own autonomy, your health, and your decision whether, when, and with whom to have a child or not. So the book is really about why abortion matters, and it really does matter to so many, for so many just diverse and different reasons. But it's really to say this isn't a religious debate. This isn't about some great philosophical question of when life begins. This is about control.
Yeah, I think that is really helpful. When I was thinking about your book and thinking about the difference that it makes when we understand what is driving this assault, that actually matters. I think that if we limit abortion and the conversation of reproductive rights broadly only in the realm of healthcare, which it is, and not as a human right, we limit our avenues to fight for it. We also limit our own understanding of how vital this right is to the lives and well-being of women.
I mean, make no mistake, it is healthcare. It is basic healthcare. It is healthcare that 1 in 4 women in their lives will seek. But I come at this as the quintessential gender equity issue. And there's also a lot of implications for race equity because of how this debate and how access to abortion and to safe motherhood has played out in our society and in our culture. But if a person can't control their basic bodily autonomy, their independence, those decisions about having say over what happens to you medically, what happens to you physically. There's the immediate implications of that for your health. There's also the greater implication of what does it say about women and people who can become pregnant in our society when we see them only as caregivers and primarily as child bearers, and that we're saying, yes, you may be anything in the world, the sky's the limit, but the minute you're in that kind of situation of being able to get pregnant or getting pregnant, that's what comes first, and you have no ability to determine the timing or the partnership or any of those kinds of things. And I think when we talk about abortion as a human right, we also have to recognize it's about the decision whether to have an abortion or not. And the reproductive justice movement in this country, which was started in the late 80s and early 90s by women of color and specifically by Black women in the South, who were really recognizing that abortion isn't all there is to it. It's the ability to really decide that you are going to be able to have children safely. Our maternal mortality rate in this country is horrific. We have to do better for women and people who are pregnant and making sure that they are able to safely continue pregnancy if they choose to do so, but also to raise children with food security, with access to education, with housing security, with a clean environment. All those pieces that play into an individual decision about whether or not you want to or even can continue a pregnancy are really human rights issues, are really about equity, or about gender equity, or about race equity. And so we do have to start thinking about this as a human rights issue and talking about it more. And many people are and have been, but politically the conversation in this sort of mainstream debate has been limited, I think, to choice and access, and also about, God help us, religion and battling religious beliefs and these deep philosophical questions about when life begins that are so individualized that it has really derailed any kind of, I think, debate about what's really at stake here for people who become pregnant and for women.
Yeah. And I think that I'm saying the we really broadly as people living in this country, is that we've accepted the terms of the debate by those who seek to limit women's freedom and be the deciders of the destinies of others. So I think that your insight around how we frame it and what we're looking at about what this battle is over is important.
And when you look at what's happened globally around this issue, when you've looked at the trends towards liberalizing access to abortion, which has been predominantly the trend in this country other than the US. But if you look at Latin America, South America, Ireland, other places that have gone from near complete bans on abortion to legal access to abortion, it really was when people stood up, women and their allies, and said, this is a human right, and made those demands. It's part of this green wave that sort of, started in Ireland and legalized abortion in Argentina and Mexico, and more recently in 2022 in Colombia. And that kind of reframing of it. And as we come upon Roe versus Wade, I guess it would be its 50th anniversary, or truncated or non-existent 50th anniversary. But when we turn back to look at what Roe versus Wade was, it was never the be all and end all. It worked for us. It was vitally important as a decision. But when you look at the legal framing of it, it was not what was going to take us where we needed to go. And indeed, it never did.
I wanted to talk more about that, both the global, what's happened elsewhere that hasn't happened here, and the lessons that we could learn, and also the mechanism for which we can enact change. I think that I am a little struck by some people, not people as yourself who've been warning about this for decades and have been talking and writing and struggling for abortion rights, but others who have suddenly said, well, Roe was never enough. And I feel like, yes, and when you don't have a floor, you can't talk about the ceiling. I feel like there's too many who are saying, well, it was never enough anyway. And in a way, it's kind of pissing on the rights of the 22 million women who right now don't have access to abortion in their state. And I know that that's not where you're coming from in this.
No, I can say that the house I'm living in needs some work. That doesn't mean let's smash it down and live on the streets while we spend 20 years building a new one. I mean, absolutely. I do not mean that we should have or that I wanted to see Roe go. It's been devastating for everybody, but particularly for, women and people who are seeking access who have none. It's putting tens of thousands of lives at risk every month because pregnancy is dangerous and lack of access to abortion is dangerous. So I in no way minimizing or saying, no, it's okay, we're going to get rid of that anyways. I think it's important to recognize, though, as we move into this new stage, and if you'll indulge me a very brief and boring legal lecture, Roe versus Wade came about at a time of tremendous change in this country, but it was in no way the Supreme Court taking the lead. It was in no way some all of a sudden progressive court saying, we need this. It was the Supreme Court doing what it does, which is kind of taking the temperature of the country. And they had just decriminalized contraceptives for unmarried people the year before Roe versus Wade in 1972, which is sort of shocking to think about. In 1965, they had decriminalized contraception for married people. So we're at a sort of time where there was a nascent women's liberation movement, so-called. There were also states that had legalized abortion. I think this is really important that in New York, Alaska, Hawaii, Colorado, others were starting to have access to abortion. In fact, New York, if you could get to New York, you could get an abortion. So again, if you have mobility, if you have funds, if you have access, if you have resources. And the Supreme Court, I think, wanted to expand the right, but they also wanted to make sure that doctors, white men in white coats, were kind of holding the hands of women who are making these decisions. They didn't want to see the kind of harm to women's health and fertility and lives that they had been seeing during the time of kind of illegal abortion. And there's a film out about the Jane Collective out of Chicago that really talks about how that
highly recommend it.
Excellent. And it's now on HBO, which is lovely to see that kind of mass reach. But that was the exception, where there were mission-driven healthcare providers who were willing to take a risk to make sure that abortion was safe. It wasn't sleazy. It wasn't, exploitative, all those kinds of things. There was a setting for that. The Roe versus Wade was a 7-2 decision. So it had justices who were appointed by both Democrats and Republicans. We were in a very different place then, but it was really founded on the right to privacy. It was one of these kind of unenumerated rights in the Constitution. And so this was a decision whether or not to have an abortion. As we sort of talked about earlier, there's two sides to this coin. It's the right to make that decision. And they set up the trimester system to sort of have a reasonable approach that within the first trimester, abortion access was unfettered. In the second trimester, the states could put some limits on it, but there had to be preservation of woman or pregnant person's life or health. And in the third trimester, it was after the point of viability, it was banned except to preserve the person's life. It was a system that worked, very soon after Roe became the law of the land. Anti-abortion opponents started chipping away, and they started with the most vulnerable. They started with poor women, cutting off federal Medicaid funding through the Hyde Amendment, which continues to be in play, and to deny all federal funding for abortion, and has spawned a bunch of copycats. I mean, the Hyde Amendment is just about Medicaid, but there's no funding for abortion if you're in the Peace Corps, if you're in the Veterans Administration, all these kinds of really targeting quite deliberately, let's get the most vulnerable people first. And from there has been sort of a 50-year plan by the far right to get us to where we are today. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that they were laser focused on getting Republican control in the states. There's a reason that when Roe versus Wade was decimated at the federal level and it went back to the states, that was a disaster for abortion rights. It doesn't have to be. It's always better to have federal constitutional protection, but we need to really up our game at the state level. And I think as we looked at the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision, which came about in 1992, that all of a sudden said, well, you could create a burden on the people who are seeking abortion access. You could set up hurdles for a woman to overcome on her way to access abortion services, but they couldn't be unduly burdensome. At that point, and for the past years, we've seen more and more of these kind of red states, anti-abortion states, really emboldened to trying new and unprecedented kinds of legislation, knowing that at some point they would get up to the Supreme Court. And once, the Republican Party saw that they could win a lot with this wedge issue of abortion, they could get people who were single issue voters who would ignore Donald Trump's indiscretions, but sort of a whole range of other policies that evangelicals and far right groups would join in supporting the Republican Party simply because of the abortion issue. They just went more and more. There was no reason not to pass a law that would have been blatantly unconstitutional under Roe versus Wade. And that's exactly what they did. That's how we ended up with this Mississippi law. It wouldn't have been on a first-year law exam under a question of the existing law. But in Mississippi, as in many, many other states, they were racing towards that Supreme Court. And then once Donald Trump appointed Justice Amy Coney Barrett, they had the votes to do exactly what they did. And that was why they were appointed. There's no surprise ending in what happened here. The game's not over yet. I think the surprise will be that we'll get to a better place. But the second piece of it is when we look at sort of the U.S. and this constitutional model and this right to privacy and this right to individual decision making, it is very much in the U.S. constitutional framework of kind of the don't tread on me, the right to be left alone. That is very different from the global, more human rights model that we're seeing. We all know the U.S. is very far behind in adopting human rights norms. We tend to have this view of American exceptionalism that we don't need. We have such a great democracy and so much liberty and freedom that we don't need human rights. Those are for people with black helicopters and blue helmets and over there and things. But the reality is that we don't have that kind of floor that human rights models offer, where it's the government's responsibility to make sure that its citizens and others within its borders have access to kind of basic human rights that allow them to live with liberty and dignity and security.
I really appreciate that breakdown that you provided and the contrast between how a right is protected and globally what we're seeing versus what we're seeing here. And I agree that it is a false notion that we can't look to models elsewhere. I think that this is a global issue and there's solutions that can be learned and flow freely in terms of ideas from country to country. I did want to step back before we talk a little bit more about what you were noting about Ireland and the Green Wave was about national protection. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that other guests have shared is the challenge of getting a law back on the books and how much easier it is to keep something on the books than it is to re-win it. And I was personally very struck by a phenomena here of a lack of fight amongst many, the majority that cares about abortion rights and the idea that we could get it back later so easily. This notion that there was some loophole that people were going to just get it back if they got more Democrats or something like that isn't really how rights are won. People thinking about national protection for human rights. I would like your thoughts on in the relationship that you see between state and national. Because I think that one of the things that I'm noticing, and I'm sure you're noticing too, is that many states have now taken away the right now that there isn't the national protection. And there are some states that have expanded the right. Or protected it. My understanding, and please correct me, you're the lawyer, if I'm wrong, is that the states that have expanded the right, that is only so far as to what the Supreme Court would allow. They could get sued or whatever, right? And it be taken away too, or not.
Right now, we're in a place where there is, no federal precedent, no constitutional right protecting abortion rights. It is all completely with the states. If we had a functional Congress, we could codify Roe. We could pass Women's Health Protection Act, which would create a statute that would require abortion rights, not as strong as the constitutional protection, but still it would be a huge step forward. That's not going to happen with this Congress. The states obviously can pass what they want. They can pass as much as they want. I don't think anybody is looking to go past the Roe framework. 70% of Americans support the Roe framework. It made sense. There are a lot of states that have access to abortion, but it still has a lot of limitations. There are others that have completely banned it. I think as far as legislatively, what's next? The ultimate goal for us has to be a gender equity amendment to the Constitution. This Constitution was written by our so-called founding fathers. They by no means had the interest of women in mind or of folks of color. If they were thinking about either group at all, it was not in a very positive or helpful way. So when we get a Supreme Court, whether it's the atrocious one we have now or even a more moderate one, they're looking at that Constitution and what enabled these justices to go very far out and say, well, there's nothing in the Constitution about abortion. I don't see it here. The founding fathers didn't, was the fact that Roe was a privacy decision that was on these unenumerated rights. They weren't spelled out in the Constitution the way other rights are. So we need to write them into the Constitution. We need to make sure that instead of sort of putting our rights together with sticky tape and string to sort of say, oh, well, Title VII prohibits employment discrimination and Pregnancy Discrimination Act prohibits pregnancy discrimination. We need to really bolster those rights by having an amendment to the Constitution. That is a big long-term goal because we need political power in the states and/or political power at the federal level. And that's going to take us a decade plus. In the states, abortion has been the punching bag of the far right for a long time. So we have anti-abortion legislators who are in these red states who are putting forward laws and restrictions that don't align with what voters want. And what we've seen through the sort of productive use of referendum in certain states, Kansas being the one that kind of came first and was the most wonderfully shocking, Michigan, other places, is that when voters are given the chance to vote thumbs up or thumbs down on access to abortion rights, it's a big thumbs up. Red states, blue states. And it's important to say here, the alignment of Democratic Party politics is not always hand in glove with abortion rights, where popular abortion rights are popular with them in the last election because it was winning. But for a long time, Hyde Amendment, other kinds of attempts to liberalize abortion law at the state and federal level were kind of seen as the third rail. It was the schmishmortion issue, as we called it. Nobody actually really wanted to come out and say abortion, never mind. The midterms have proven otherwise, and I think going forward, yes, we need to elect candidates who really are going to support abortion rights, and we need to hold their feet to the fire that we want to see them produce for us, and that this is not something that's just they can tick the box and say, well, I wish we could do better. But we also need to think about referendums and how we can use those to carve out abortion rights in red states. And one of the big pieces of legislation that's coming around now is telehealth across state lines. They passed one in Massachusetts, and there's a good chance of one coming out of New York. And what that would allow medical providers, clinicians in states where abortion is legal would be to provide telehealth to people in states where abortion is severely restricted or banned. You do a telehealth consult to the provider in the legal state, and they mail you medication abortion. That could be game changing. Some of the FDA regulations remain in place and kind of hinder access to medication abortion, but the recent change by the Biden administration through the FDA to allow pharmacies to provide medication abortion could be a real step forward, both for people in states where abortion is legal because they can do a telehealth consult and not have to drive hours and hours, or just it opens up more options for people, but also for people in red states needing abortion or in places where it's banned or limited because it allows medication abortion. And there's kind of the big long-term goal of amending the Constitution. There's the immediate political power. And then there really is the kind of movement-based and the more direct action of increasing access for women and pregnant people to get medication abortion. And medication abortion is kind of what separates us from the Janes, so to speak, is that it is a real improvement in abortion access, abortion procedures. surgical abortion is very safe and is much preferred by a lot of people for many good reasons, but medication abortion has been game changing, particularly now in a post-Dobbs world. It's a 2-pill regimen that is very safe and effective up to 11 weeks and possibly later in pregnancy. It allows the person who's taking the medication to self-induce, to have control over where and how they, start the abortion procedure.
Yeah, I think that in many ways, the abortion medication has been an absolute game changer, and it is not available for all women right now and people who seek it, nor can it be used later in pregnancy. We need all options on the table for as many people as possible. It is also on a target of those who seek to ban abortion don't just seek to ban surgical abortion. The majority are abolitionists. They don't want any abortion.
Right. Or contraception or same-sex relationships I mean, so it goes back to this control issue of worldview. And
I just say that because we can increase access, but then if they go for the abortion ban, they ban medication abortions, or if we're leaving it just to the goodwill of pharmacies and they feel like the antis are more vocal than we are, then they're going to go with not offering it.
I mean, and this is why we say don't put all your ovum in one basket. The reality is that the genie is out of the bottle and that there are ways of accessing pills, either through Aid Access, which is an international group that provides pills through mail with a physician. There are community groups where people are driving to Tijuana and coming back with minivans full and distributing them through the community. And particularly women of color who have been excluded from the medical system for decades and face structural racism and are used to doing what needs to get done. And so I think we need to support those really grassroots, arguably legal, maybe not kind of efforts, as well as try to pass laws, as well as try to get telehealth from registered clinicians. We need to be in many different places at once for exactly what you're saying, because it's a moving target. But we have the majority of people, this has traditionally been something, or historically been something of a women's rights issue. In many ways it should be led by women and by women of color, but we need allies. And we've seen through Black Lives Matters, we've seen through marriage equality that these issues need allies in government. We need corporate allies. We need religious allies and community allies. We need to, really destigmatize the conversation around abortion and recognize it as a human right. I think we're already talking much more boldly and differently about it, which has been a nice part to see post-Dobbs, or even since the draft opinion leaked. I think we've seen much more mainstream, so to speak, conversation about abortion, which I think helps normalize it and is way, way overdue.
You had mentioned this being the punching bag for Republicans, and you were also talking about Democrats sometimes are out of line with abortion rights, that they don't always go in hand. And I think that that is a very fair assessment, because how many approved Hyde? Roe could have been codified for 50 years. How long was the motto safe, legal, and rare? For how long did we go by words like choice and not use the word abortion? Or for how long, when abortion was at stake, including by this administration, the White House, not use the word abortion? And so I think that these are conversations that are important to have, so that as the people, we compel action. Right. And I think that while it is totally true that people need to do everything and all things to increase abortion rights, and I very much appreciate your point that we cannot wait forever, that this cannot be a 40-year battle. You were talking about this, I think, before we even recorded. When we talk about it as a 40-year battle, we not only are accepting the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, that would be forced to give birth against their will, and a whole culture that would then have normalized women and those who can become pregnant as second-class citizens. But the likelihood that then you'd be in a position to win it back is not true if you aren't making wins before that.
Right. We're in a different place. I often hear the second wave feminists say, well, the younger generation, they took it for granted. They took these rights for granted. I was like, well, they didn't take these rights for granted. They're human rights. They should be taken for granted. I'm not going to give gratitude for the fresh air I breathe. I should have fresh air all the time. So I think we're in a different place now, though, that we have a different conversation. We've seen more. Yes, we lost the substantive rights, and I don't want to minimize those in any ways, but we know it in a way. We just need to take back the political power. And every country in the world that has been through this, I did a lot of work in Ireland, and it's
I was hoping
Catholic country. And I'm like, the countries are not Catholic. Tables are not Catholic. People are Catholic, and political power may be dominated by a certain religion or not. And so it's taking that power, that disproportionate power that religion has in this country. And we've seen it play out in a lot of different ways. I mean, we've seen this Supreme Court does exactly what it's designed to do. It reinforces the status quo. It reinforces power. And there have been some examples where they've granted rights when they've kind of had to. I mean, by the time they granted marriage equality, there were already many states that same-sex marriage was completely legal. And how the court didn't want to face a world in which what happened to my marriage when I crossed state lines, or your marriage when you did this and that. So we have to be realistic about the power structures that are behind it. So it goes back to everybody can do something, and you have to pick what fits best. For some people, that will be in the state legislatures, and some it'll be in DC within the Beltway. For others, it will be mass movements in the streets and really demanding our human rights. And I think that's something we haven't talked about yet, but is such an effective tool. I mean, that was fundamental to the Green Wave.
I was hoping you could kind of talk a little bit more about that. Why is that decisive in many ways?
I think mass movements are decisive for the moment that they are, in that when you get people pouring into the streets, it's energizing. It's never been my first love of sort of getting out there and marching. And every time I do it, it's uplifting. It reminds me that we're there in community, that there are other people. It's three-dimensional, it's tactile, it's visual. I think it brings people together in a way that nothing else does. It shows those in power that there is a real demand. In any good protest, there's always sort of an edge to it, that it could demand more than the establishment wants even. And I think the images stay for every person who marches. There's however many at home who are watching and there in spirit. I think it is a really important and powerful tool. Frankly, and for some, it's a tool of privilege, because to be able to go somewhere and march and take time and not have children or elder care or anything else, or jobs and that kind of thing. So I think for those of us who can march, it's imperative that we do, because not everyone can. I think it's vital to energizing, its messaging. There's nothing more powerful than sort of an image of a handwritten human rights sign. I saw that a lot in Ireland, of you just get your messaging out there in a way that doesn't happen through the kind of staged conversations on the nightly news and things otherwise.
One thing that strikes me by both Ireland and all over Latin America, where so many places have decriminalized abortion, as you were alluding to earlier, these are deeply Catholic-dominated countries. These are deeply patriarchal societies. And the women, and I'm saying women because this is mainly who is involved in these struggles, who took to the streets in both situations in Ireland and then throughout Latin America, they did so at great risk. And I think that that is worth noting. These were situations where it wasn't your, and I do not mean any disrespect when I say this, it wasn't your staged Saturday protest.
Well, and I would add Poland to that too. When you're fascist-dominated countries, there is real physical risk and retribution and things, and government misconduct and all of these. And what's interesting is that many times these protests are spurred by the horrific, tragic death of women who are seeking abortion services, often for miscarriage management. For better or for worse, it ends up being kind of something as horrific as the death of Savita Halappanavar in Ireland in 2008. That was wanted pregnancy, a family that spoke out. We had 2 cases I think in Poland this year. I'm mixing up my horrific regimes. That's, I think, what causes part of it. In Argentina, the protests actually started in response to violence against women that was not specifically around abortion, but I think people very quickly, the narrative kind of shifted to say, you know, this is really a state harm and state sanctioned harm against women, and sort of being against the Catholic Church. I mean, there are a lot of people who have deep faith and are part of the Catholic Church, but don't agree with everything that the male hierarchy says. So you see this in Catholic countries, that people don't agree with the church's stance on contraception or on abortion, and throughout different religions. I mean, all fundamentalist religions kind of end up in the same place, I think, except for Judaism. The far ends, they all end up similarly.
Even in Judaism, I hate to say, the Chabad and are not pro-abortion.
Right. Well, there's a little more wiggle room if the life of the mother is at stake, but right. It's where and how individuals feel. You know, even when you ask somebody their religious affiliation, that doesn't mean that they fall lockstep with all that. And so what we saw in Ireland was, after marriage equality, after the death of Savita Halappanavar, after we had a victory at the European Court of Human Rights, the conversation had been changing, and it was changing in Parliament as there were more women and people with lived experience around abortion who were being elected. But it was also changing in the pubs, in the conversations around kitchen tables, around people feeling better about coming out and saying, what does this mean to me personally? Whether or not somebody has had an abortion, what does it say to live in a country that so devalues women and people who can become pregnant, and that so enforces this gender binary and traditional gender roles around childbearing and child rearing, that they are going to completely ban a necessary and safe and widely used medical procedure. And so you're making that leap from the sort of vast human rights arguments to really people understanding individually. And I think in this country, that's happening too. We understand the right to privacy, but we're demanding a lot more than that in this day and age. And I think that's really important. And we're seeing the connections between controlling abortion, controlling sexuality, controlling gender identity, and even controlling who has access to healthcare because of their immigration status or because of structural inequalities and racism. And I feel positive that we're in a much better place as far as recognition and willingness to act. I still feel like we have to just keep on struggling in the political sphere. We have to keep making sure that people who need access to abortion get it, whether through funds that will help them travel if they want to and need to, or through getting them direct access to medication abortion. And, in the long term, really changing this country to recognize the kind of human rights that we need, and to realize that our Constitution has done us well in many ways, but it was always meant to be a living, breathing document, and it really needs to come into this century, if not this millennium.
And I think taking a page from our sisters in Latin America, in Ireland, and being relentless in raising our demand, really compelling the powers that be to confront in a living way that we are a people that refuse to live in a country that deems women less than full human beings, and that we won't relent until abortion is a codified right, I think really does make a difference. And I think that one of the lessons that I always take whenever I hear people talk about the green wave is people being decisive in changing what was seen as possible through their actions. It was so unheard of, so off the pale, out of possibility that it would be decriminalized. Right. And they did it not by restricting themselves to only the official channels, but to seeing their own power. And I'm not saying don't vote. I'm not saying any of those things. What I am saying is that the rights that we've won have never been won through voting alone, right? Including the right for women to vote. So I think that there's the centrality and the decisiveness that our action plays, and to not forget the power that we do have.
And to be brave about it. I mean, look, there's been a lot of chest thumping and threatening by anti-abortion politicians. We're going to arrest you if you travel. We're going to arrest you if you fund other people to travel. We're going to arrest you if you do this and that and the other. Well, we're more than 6 months in, and that hasn't been happening. And when it does, we'll deal with it. But if we start showing restraint or self-censoring or being too risk-averse, adverse. The only people who we're harming are the people who we need to help the most, and those on the margins, and women and people who are seeking abortion who don't have the resource and the access. So I couldn't agree more. I think it's time to be brave. Everybody has different levels of risk they can take and should take, but we're starting to normalize the conversation. We're starting to destigmatize abortion. We've made, I think, tremendous progress since the Dobbs axe fell, but we got to keep it up, and we've got to keep testing the waters of how far we can go to help individuals and to keep bringing the mass movement that we need to see, and to put this issue of abortion within issues of control and sexuality and discrimination, and most of all, gender and race equity.
I want to thank you. I could talk to you forever, Julie, but I want to be sensitive to your time. I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your insights, your perspective, your time with us. And we will put in a link to your Twitter handle and your website and all of that in the show notes. I wanted to just give you a chance if there's anything that you wanted to add on.
I want to thank you and to people who are listening, because I think the first thing is to educate ourselves and activate and motivate others. And there are people who will listen to me, but there are a lot more people who will listen to people they know. And so take our conversation. I so appreciate you having this discussion and this forum. And I hope everybody will take it and head to somebody they know and have a kind of brave conversation and just start talking about this, because more people believe more strongly than we think and than we know. And that's part of creating the change we need.
Thanks so much, Julie.
Thank you, Sam. It's great to talk to you.
In further reflecting on this conversation, I think it's important to think about how we're viewing these world-shaping events. Look at the fact that Ireland and Argentina and Colombia and Mexico decriminalized abortion, while in the US, we lost the right. Or that some states have criminalized it while others have secured it. Within electoral politics and among the legal community, it's almost impossible to avoid the thinking that this is some horse race where sometimes we're winning and sometimes they are. But in the bigger picture, we have to recognize what's driving all this, the compulsions and crises in the world that are shaping things, how fascism is building and consolidating power, and that this struggle will reshape everything, in either a radically liberating way or a radically reactionary way. It's something we'll continue to return to in future episodes. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Thanks for being part of this community. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, ideas for topics, or guests, or lend a skill. We hope to do our first episode dedicated completely to your questions really soon, so send them in. You can tweet me at samvgoldman, or you can drop me a line at samanthagoldman@refusefascism.org. We're on Mastodon as well, so see the show notes for that. We'd love to hear a voicemail from you. Leave us a voicemail by visiting anchor.fm/refuse-fascism and hit that message button. Want to support the show? It's simple. Show us some love by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. And of course, follow, subscribe, so you never miss an episode. You can also literally put it on your forehead with our Refuse Fascism beanie that John mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, available at refusefascism.org, and start the conversation. Ship in to support our pod and content creation to help people understand and act to stop the fascist threat. Whether you can give $3 or $30, it all makes a difference in producing and promoting this independent weekly podcast. You can give by visiting refusefascism.org and hitting that donate button. Thanks to Richie Marini, Coco Das, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers. We have transcripts available for each show, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. We'll be back next Sunday. Until then, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.